All right, today we are going to keep reading chapter 7 of Hatchet. When we read last, Brian had gotten really sick from eating those, what he called gut cherries, but were probably likely choke cherries, and he decided that he needed to find some different food. So he had gone looking and he found some raspberries. And after he had eaten and then picked some, he went and turned on the path and he saw a bear. And that is where we're going to pick back up today. Instead, he picked more raspberries and put them in his windbreaker, feeling the morning sun on his back and thinking he was rich. Rich with food now, just rich. And he heard a noise to his rear, a slight noise, and he turned and saw the bear. He could do nothing, think nothing. His tongue, stained with berry juice, stuck to the roof of his mouth, and he stared at the bear. It was black, with a cinnamon-colored nose, not 20 feet from him, and big. No, huge. It was all black, fur and huge. He had seen one in the zoo in the city once, a black bear, but it had been from India or somewhere. This one was wild and much bigger than the one in the zoo, and it was right there. The sun caught the ends of the hairs along his back. Shining black and silky, the bear stood on its hind legs, half up, and studied Brian. Just studied him, then lowered itself and moved slowly to the left, eating berries as it rolled along, waffling and delicately using its mouth to lift each berry from the stem, and in seconds it was gone. Gone. And Brian still had not moved. His tongue was stuck to the top of his mouth, the tip half out. His eyes were wide and his hands were reaching for a berry. Then he made a low sound. It made no sense. It was just a sound of fear, of disbelief, that something that large could have come so close to him without his knowing. It just walked up to him and could have eaten him, and he could have done nothing. Nothing. And when the sound was half done, a thing happened with his legs. A thing he had nothing to do with, and they were running in the opposite direction from the bear, back toward the shelter. He would have run all the way in panic, but after he had gone perhaps 50 yards, his brain took over and slowed, and finally stopped him. If the bear had wanted you, his brain said, he would have taken you. It is something to understand, he thought, not something to run away from. The bear was eating berries, not people. The bear made no move to hurt you, to threaten you. It stood to see you better, study you, then went on its way eating berries. It was a big bear, but it did not want you, did not want to cause you harm, and that is the thing to understand here. He turned and looked back at the stand of raspberries. The bear was gone. The birds were singing. He saw nothing that could hurt him. There was no danger here, and he could sense, could feel. In the city at night, there was sometimes danger. You could not be in the park at night after dark because of the danger. But here the bear had looked at him and had moved on, and this filled his thoughts. The berries were so good, so sweet and rich, and his body was so empty. And the bear had almost indicated that it didn't mind sharing, had just walked from him. And the berries were so good. And he thought finally, if he did not go back and get the berries, he would have to eat the gut cherries again tomorrow. That convinced him, and he walked slowly back to the raspberry patch and continued picking for the entire morning, although with great caution. And once, when a squirrel rustled some pine needles at the base of a tree, he nearly jumped out of his skin. About noon, the sun was almost straight overhead. The clouds began to thicken and look dark. In moments, it started to rain, and he took what he had picked and trotted back to the shelter. He had eaten probably 2 pounds of raspberries and had maybe another 3 pounds in his jacket, rolled in a pouch. He had made it to his shelter just as the clouds completely opened and the rain roared down in sheets. Soon the sand outside was drenched, and there were rivets running down to the lake. But inside he was dry and snug. He started to put the picked berries back in the sorted pile with the gut cherries, but noticed that the raspberries were seeping through the jacket. They were much softer than the gut cherries and apparently were being crushed a bit with their own weight. When he held the jacket up and looked beneath it, he saw a stream of red liquid. He put a finger in it and found it to be sweet and tangy like pop without the fizz. and he grinned and lay back on the sand, holding the bag up over his face and letting the seepage drip into his mouth. Outside the rain poured down, but Brian lay back, drinking the syrup from the berries, dry and with the pain almost all gone, the stiffness also gone, his belly full and a good taste in his mouth. For the first time since the crash, he was not thinking of himself, of his own life. Brian was wondering if the bear was as surprised as he to find another being in the berries. Later in the afternoon, as evening came down, he went to the lake and washed the sticky berry juice from his face and hands, then went back to prepare for the night. While he had accepted and understood that the bear did not want to hurt him, it was still much in his thoughts, and as darkness came into the shelter, he took the hatchet out of his belt and put it by his head, his hand on the handle, as the day caught up with him and he slept. Chapter 8. At first he thought it was a growl. In the still darkness of the shelter in the middle of the night, his eyes came open, and he was awake, and he thought there was a growl. But it was the wind. A medium wind in the pines had made some sound that brought him awake. He sat up and was hit with the smell. It terrified him. The smell was one of rot, some musty rot that made him think only of graves with cobwebs and dust and old death. His nostrils widened, and he opened his eyes wider, but he could see nothing. It was too dark with clouds covering in the small light from the stars, and he could not see. But the smell was alive and full in the shelter. He thought of the bear, thought of Bigfoot, and every monster he had ever seen in every fright movie he had ever watched, and his heart hammered in his throat. Then he heard the slithering, a slithering, brushing sound near his feet. And he kicked out as hard as he could, kicked out and threw the hatchet at the sound, a noise coming from his throat. But the hatchet missed, sailed into the wall where it hit the rocks with a shower of sparks, and his leg was instantly torn with pain as if 100 needles had been driven into it. Now he screamed with the pain and fear and skittered on his backside up into the corner of the shelter, breathing through his mouth, straining to see, to hear. The slithering moved again, he thought, toward him at first, and terror took him, stopping his breath. Then he felt he could see a low, dark form, a bulk in the darkness, a shadow that lived, but now it moved away. Slithering and scraping, it moved away, and he saw or thought he saw it go out of the door opening. He lay on his side for a moment, then pulled a rasping breath in and held it, listened for the attacker to return. When it was apparent that the shadow wasn't coming back, he felt the calf of his leg where the pain was centered and spreading to fill the whole leg. His fingers gingerly touched a group of needles that had been driven through his pants and into the fleshy part of his calf. They were stiff and very sharp on the ends that stuck out, and he knew then what the attacker had been. A porcupine had stumbled into his shelter, and when he had kicked it, the thing had slapped him with its tail of quills. He touched each quill carefully. The pain made it seem as if dozens of them had been slammed into his leg, but there were only 8, pinning the cloth against his skin. He leaned back against the wall for a minute. He couldn't leave them in. They had to come out, but just touching them made the pain more intense. And we'll pause there for today and finish Chapter 8 tomorrow.